Tomorrow, in cities and towns all across the country, people will gather to honor the legacy and remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Growing up in the South and growing up in Atlanta in particular, Dr. King and his legacy loom large. All over the city, there are statues and art installations of Dr. King. There are enough streets named after Dr. King that it can be confusing. There's a lot of Dr. King, MLK boulevards and streets, and a lot of Peachtree roads too. So you kind of got to know where you're going in Atlanta. But Dr. King's legacy in Atlanta is an important one. It was, other than Alabama, it was the southern state where he spent the most time. And over in Alabama, there's a civil rights memorial that has a quote attributed to MLK, and it says, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Has that in parentheses and quotes, and then beneath it, it has dash Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in true Alabama fashion, there is a problem with that. Did anyone know what it is? He didn't say that. Originally, that's right. The prophet Amos said that. So they should have put a little quote under, a little dash under MLK Jr. that says, the prophet Amos. That's kind of Alabama, though. That's so just for a little information. You know how Washington people make fun? Do you make fun of Oregon or do you make fun of Idaho? Like, which state do you look down on a little bit? Like, Idaho, yeah, that's what it seems like. That's both, yeah. That's Alabama to Georgia. They're kind of like, oh, the Alabamans, they don't get things right very often. Just so you know, just putting that in context. So, but Dr. King did say that. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an everlasting stream. He actually said that in his I Have a Dream speech. And if you look back through his public speeches and sermons, Dr. King was fond of quoting the Old Testament prophets. And he quoted them a lot. In his I Have a Dream speech, he has that quote from the prophet Amos, but he also quoted Isaiah, where he said, "The valley shall be exalted and every hill and mountain made low." King knew the prophets and he quoted them often. The question is, why? Why did he go to the prophets a lot when speaking? There we go. You nailed it, Judy. Because they spoke about justice, and the prophets spoke in particular about justice to a struggling people. Amos preached directly to the Israelites of the southern kingdom back when it was divided, warning them about the troubles that were going to come because of profound economic injustice. And he said, if you don't fix this, then bad things will happen. He spoke to a people who were held captive, and they weren't held captive by the Egyptians or the Babylonians, but they were held captive by injustice and by economic disparity. And so he said, if you don't correct your ways, then justice is going to roll down and righteousness is going to blow through here. So King quoted the prophets a lot because he talked about justice. And he talked about hope. Isaiah, who we hear from today, spoke to a people not who were held captive by injustice and economic disparity, but people who were held captive in Babylon. They were taken into exile, and in particular, I think this is very interesting from what the biblical scholars and historians tell us, that the people of Israel who were taken captive, who were taken into exile into Babylon, were largely middle and upper class Israelites. So they didn't gather up the workers and the less thans, the people who were disempowered economically. Who they gathered up were folks like us. middle class, upper middle class, and some upper class. And they took them to a foreign land. And there they stayed for anywhere between 50 and 70 years. It's just a long time. It's a generation or two. And there the Israelites, they worked or were made to work. And they made homes as best they could, and they had children. And not surprisingly, this time of exile deeply impacted their way of life and the way they thought of themselves. Because they saw themselves as God's chosen people. And then they were scooped up, taken into exile, made into slaves and servants. And they looked around, and the landscape was unfamiliar, and the food was unfamiliar, the economy was unfamiliar, their status was not one they had chosen. Nothing looked the same. They were a displaced community. They had gone from thriving in their homeland to just barely surviving as exiles in Babylon. So think about that experience for a minute, how unsettling. It would be like somebody just picked us all up and took us away so we never saw our homes again, and extended family members and friends, and took us to Alabama and just plopped us down and said, okay, get to work, and we'll just barely keep you alive. But Isaiah speaks to those people, directly to those people in exile. And he reminds them that they're not to just survive, that they're not called to just survive, that they're called to thrive. They're called to be a holy people, a light on a hill, and makes a promise and said, I will move you like the Exodus of old out of captivity. It will be a journey of cleansing and renewal. And there's a key to this, though. And this is what Isaiah is talking about in this passage today, as he says, you are not meant to be here in exile and captivity, but there's a way forward. He says the trick to it is don't dwell on the past. Don't dwell on the hurts, and don't dwell on the glory, unless, or just in case, so that you don't miss out on what comes next. Isaiah saw the true danger of captivity was that it was getting familiar, that people were getting accustomed to it and getting used to it. And Isaiah says to them, don't do that. Don't make this place of exile comfortable. Don't make it your home. Don't settle. Instead, choose hope and look ahead. And so it asks some questions of them. It asks this question of a community in exile. It asks what is required. If you're a community in exile, if you're a displaced community, what is required of you? First, Isaiah says, don't yearn for the past. Don't glorify it. And then don't make peace with comfortable captivity. So I am aware that none of us right now are in physical exile. I don't think anyone here has been scooped up and brought to Bellevue and plopped down and things aren't familiar. I'm probably the closest one who's been scooped up and plopped down in Bellevue, and I'm happy I'm here, so I don't count. But I do look at our lives right now and how unfamiliar everything seems. It wasn't that long ago that if you wanted to talk on the phone, you had to go to your kitchen and get a phone off the wall. And if it was a really old phone, it had the rotary dial. And if you got it wrong, you had to start all over. And if you wanted a private phone call on that rotary phone, what did you have to do? Oh, yeah, if somebody picked it up. But you remember, at least our kitchen phone had a really long cord. And you'd actually like go around the corner and just hope that nobody was eavesdropping. That was phone calls back then. Party lines. That was it got fancy. Operators. Yeah, I need to. Now each of us carries a phone with us 24/7, and landlines like home phones are becoming a thing in the past. Used to be, and I'm just sort of generalizing here, but it used to be that if you wanted to talk to a friend on the phone, say you're a teenager or a young person, you'd call, and generally their parents would answer. And you'd have to say, I'd like to talk to Josh, please, or something like that. But that's not how it happens anymore, because our youth have direct phones. They have their own phones, so we don't get to meet their friends the same. Technology has changed dramatically in the past 20 or 30 years. Dramatically. Used to be there was 3 channels. Now there's 300. So we look at technology, and it's very different. Our vehicles. Half our vehicles talk to us all the time and try to drive for us, which is terrifying. It doesn't look the same. Think about the political arena right now. Now, I'm under no illusion that politics has ever been nice. It's never been one good person politely debating another good person. Even back in the quote-unquote good old days, that's not what politics played out like. But it's pretty different now, isn't it? The political field, political landscape is very different. About the church. This thing that's been so familiar to probably all of us for so many years, it's different. The buildings look the same, but what happens in them is kind of different. Used to be just open the doors and the pews would fill. And you had kids and you had multiple generations. It's not like that anymore. The church has changed. Schools have changed. There's probably not a single one of us who ever went to school worried about shooters. I certainly didn't. I was concerned with how much trouble I was going to get in for not doing my homework. If it was pizza day for lunch. School's not like that now. What else has changed? Our family structures have changed, right? It wasn't that long ago where families generally were around each other, that people didn't often move across the country. And you knew your uncles and aunts and cousins and stuff like that. But it's not how it is anymore. Like all of these major things in our lives, technology and politics and the church and family structure and school structures and all of that, they're different now, aren't they? They're really different now. And even in the past 5 years, 10 years at most, things have changed dramatically. Now all of a sudden we have Zoom. And you can go to church and stay in your jammies, which is pretty good. And there's a temptation, and I hope we're not giving into it, to look back to the good old days when things were great. I hope we're not doing that right now. Sounds like we were. Sounds like I was going that direction, but I hope we don't do that, because that phrase, the good old days when things were great, sounds a bit too familiar to a certain person's phrase that ended up on a bunch of hats. I want to, this is an aside for the whole Make America Great Again thing. Number one, it's an impossibility. because things were never great. Think about, most of us would probably love to have the body of an 18-year-old again, where our knees didn't hurt, our backs weren't injured. But to be 18 again, it's terrible. It was terrible. It was confusing. We all had acne. We didn't know who we were. Half child, half adult. We can't look back and say everything was great back then. I've told this story in the little discussion group we have on Mondays, but I'll tell it here. The very first church I pastored in Idaho, it was a small ranching town in the middle of Idaho, 2 hours north of Boise. And there was a particular church member named Charlotte, good-hearted person. She had this refrain that came up almost every conversation you'd have with her. I remember when ... And it was always about how great the valley was when she was younger. I ... when there was no crime here. I remember when there was no homelessness here. I remember when people treated each other nicely and ... And this was just every conversation. And finally, one of the church members who had known her for a long time said, Charlotte, do you ever stop to think that not everyone's experience was like yours? Do you ever stop to think that maybe it was great for you because your father was the most important, most powerful, wealthiest rancher and landowner in that valley, and you were his only child? And maybe it was idyllic and paradise and great for you because everyone was terrified of your family. But go talk to the day laborers and the women in households that were poor and all of that, and it wasn't great for them. And that's the problem with the whole Make America Great thing again. Number one, it's a fiction and it's an impossibility. But two, things are never great for certain people. And to want to go back to some fictional past for those for whom it wasn't great, minorities and women and LGBTQ people and neurodiverse people and all of that, people should be outraged that there's some sentiment about going back. And that's actually precisely what Isaiah warns the Israelites about. He says, life is not back there. You cannot go back. Back then wasn't so great anyway, and no, even if it was great, you can't go back. Home is not back there in the good old days because life is ahead. The way is always forward. Even if it's what in front of us, even if it looks scary and it feels like it's just all unknown. This text reminds us, I hope, that if we will venture forward, that God will provide. And even though I've kind of set it up like the past is bad and the future is good, I don't think that this text is quite as polarized as that. It's not as simple as that. I think Isaiah knew, as do we, that we have a relationship with our past. That we can't just be like, forget everything to do with our past and only look forward. Because that's not realistic. We can't give ourselves amnesia, and it's probably not good to. But Isaiah did say, do not worship the past and don't glorify the past. Learn from it. Be supported by it. But live facing forward. A number of years ago, many years ago, 18 years ago or something like that, I was asked to preach at annual conference when I was a shiny, new, young clergy person. Every year, and it's become kind of a joke for those of us who've been around a little bit. Every year, the conference trots out the next young, shiny clergy person who's going to be the next big thing. And, when they tap you on the shoulder and you're a young clergy person, you're like, oh, man. Finally getting recognized after 2 years of ministry. And then the next year, you're kind of on the, you're not it anymore. The next young clergy person is the person that we're going to look to and lift up as the shining hope of Christianity. And then they're put on the scrap heap. And the next year, they get another one. But this year was my year. It was like 2005, something like that. And they asked me to speak. And I think in a rare moment of insight and wisdom, talking about our churches, I encourage them to take down their old photos. Take down the pictures of when our Sunday school classes had 30, 40, 50, 60 people in them. Maybe even take down, and I've joked about this before, the Hall of Presidents, the Hall of Pastors, where you have the photos of the pastors on the walls. You don't have to get rid of them. Don't have to burn them. Certain somebody's dad is on that wall. And you don't have to take all of the historic mementos down, but shouldn't there be an equal number of things that are like sketches of what our dreams over? This is what we dream about. This is what we hope for. These are the plans that we're making. This is what we're going to try to do. Shouldn't there at least be equal number of things that we set our eyes on that are about our future, that are about our hopes that we feel called towards? And so I still think there's some truth to that. Had a conversation. Did I tell this story? I'm really tired today. I didn't sleep much last night. Did I tell this story last week? Where, and maybe I told it in our discussion group, where I have 3 close friends. Many of you met them. And I have hopefully more than 3 close friends, but those are my 3 closest friends that we go back to like 2nd and 3rd grade, and we have this group chat that we talk all the time. And we went down the road. Did I tell this last week? I did last week. Was it in the group or was it in here? Okay, well, I'm going to tell it now. So you two can go to sleep. And so we were texting, and we just went way down memory lane, as you do when you're hanging out with old friends. And we got done chatting and signed off, and I was a little bothered. I was like, all right, that's always fun, but what about the future? And so I logged back on and said, guys, like, it's always great to remember with you guys, but like, what are you excited about in your future? And the conversation got really quiet. And I think all of us realized that we weren't paying enough attention to tomorrow. And so we each started in our own way to make decisions so that we did have things to look forward to, that there was some hope for things to come. And I think that's true of us as a church body as well. And I think this congregation in Bellevue First are doing a good job at that, of recognizing that the past is what it is. Has some good, has some bad. But our call is to look forward. At its core, I've come to believe that this text from Isaiah is actually about faithfulness. God's faithfulness not to leave a people in captivity or exile. God's faithfulness to provide for people when they're on the move, when they're not in their old home and they're not at their new home yet. And it's about God placing ways and people and opportunities in front of us that will guide us if we will see them and if we will follow. Dr. King had a speech that was entitled, "Where do we go from here?" And in that speech he said, we must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. He said that to a people and to a country where the future didn't look so bright. We must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. That was true then. I think it's true now. And so let us do that. Called to renewal. Called by hope. Led by faith. Let us walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. In God's grace, may it be so. And amen.